When Abraham Lincoln was murdered, the Civil War was nearly over, but the struggle over what peace would mean had barely begun. His death removed the president most closely associated with reunion and gave control of Reconstruction to a successor whose priorities pushed the country toward a far more bitter settlement. That is the pattern behind these 7 deaths. A president can spend years building a record, then leave office in a single moment that changes the people, laws, and crises surrounding the presidency. In some cases, the death created a constitutional test. In others, it opened the door to a war, a scandal, or a political reaction that the president himself had never intended. To judge these stories, you have to look beyond the popularity of the man or the drama of the killing. The real question is simpler. What changed because he died when he did? Start with Lincoln. On the night of April 14, 1865, the Union had defeated the Confederacy. Confederate armies were surrendering. The central military question was nearly settled, but the political question was not. Millions of formerly enslaved people faced an uncertain future. Southern states had to be brought back into the Union. The federal government had to decide whether the former Confederacy would return under lenient terms or under a major transformation of Southern society. Lincoln had publicly supported reunion, but he had also begun to imagine a place for Black Americans in the post-war nation. His policies were incomplete, and historians still debate how far he would have gone. That uncertainty matters. Lincoln's death did not produce a single predictable outcome. It removed the person who might have balanced competing pressures at the most dangerous point in the country's transition. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was a Unionist from Tennessee who opposed expanding federal power on behalf of formerly enslaved people. Johnson's approach allowed former Confederate leaders to return to political influence and left the new freedom of Black Americans exposed to hostile state governments. Congress eventually fought him over Reconstruction, civil rights, and control of the federal government itself. The result was not simply a change in leadership, it was a change in the path of Reconstruction. The country moved through political conflict, military occupation in the South, constitutional amendments, and a long retreat from federal protection. Lincoln's assassination became part of the origin story of that unfinished settlement. You can see the contradiction clearly. Lincoln's death came at the moment when Americans wanted the war to be over, but ending the fighting did not end the conflict. His death removed him from the political process, just as the consequences of victory were being decided. More than a century later, the United States still lives with the racial and constitutional questions that Reconstruction failed to settle. James Garfield died in 1881, and his presidency had lasted only a few months. During that short period, he had become entangled in a fight over who controlled federal jobs. At the time, government positions were often treated as political rewards. A president was expected to distribute offices to supporters, and party factions could see appointments as proof of power. Garfield wanted to resist the influence of the faction led by Senator Roscoe Conkling, but the conflict was already damaging his administration before the shooting that ended his life. Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker. The wound itself was serious, but the medical treatment that followed became part of the tragedy. Doctors repeatedly probed for the bullet, and infection spread through Garfield's body. He survived for weeks before dying. The assassination forced Americans to confront a system that had helped create the confrontation. Garfield had not been killed in a foreign war or a constitutional crisis. He had been attacked by a man who believed political service entitled him to personal advancement. That belief was extreme, but it grew from a system many politicians accepted as normal. After Garfield's death, public pressure helped produce the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It began moving federal employment away from pure patronage and toward competitive examinations and professional standards. The reform was gradual and incomplete, but it changed the basic expectation of what government work should be. Garfield's own presidency did not have time to achieve much. His death did. It turned an internal party dispute into a national argument about public administration. The long-term effect was larger than the policy agenda of his brief time in office because it helped establish the idea that government jobs belong to the public, not simply to the party that won. William McKinley's death changed the country in a different way. He was shot in 1901 after winning a second term and presiding over a period when the United States was becoming a more active power overseas. McKinley's administration was associated with the Spanish-American War and the American acquisition of overseas territories. The country was debating whether this expansion was temporary, defensive, or the beginning of an American empire. McKinley's death placed Theodore Roosevelt in the presidency. Roosevelt had been vice president, but he represented a much more forceful style of leadership. He believed the federal government should act aggressively in public life, regulate powerful corporations, protect some natural resources, and present American power more visibly abroad. His presidency gave that style a national platform. It would be too simple to say that McKinley's assassination created the progressive era or invented American imperialism. Those forces already existed. Industrial growth, labor unrest, reform movements, and overseas expansion were all larger than one man. But succession changes timing, emphasis, and political confidence. Roosevelt received the office at a moment when the country was ready to test how much energy could be placed in the executive branch. McKinley's death therefore mattered less because it erased a specific law than because it changed the direction and personality of American power. A relatively cautious administration was followed by a president who made the White House more visible, more confrontational, and more involved in conflicts once left to Congress, courts, corporations, or state governments. The assassination also strengthened efforts to protect presidents. The Secret Service, originally created for financial crimes, became responsible for presidential protection soon afterward. A political killing had exposed both the reach of modern violence and the vulnerability of the executive office. Theodore Roosevelt survived the presidency. McKinley did not. Yet the country that emerged from McKinley's death was more comfortable with the idea that one energetic president could shape national policy directly. That expectation would outlast Roosevelt himself. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not assassinated, but his death in 1945 changed the country at the edge of victory and uncertainty. He had been president through the Great Depression and most of the Second World War. By the time he died, the United States had built a large federal role in economic and social policy, mobilized an enormous military, and become one of the central powers in a new international order. Roosevelt's influence was so extensive that his death raised a basic question. Could the system he built function without him? He was succeeded by Harry Truman, who had been vice president for only a short time and had not been fully informed about some of the most consequential wartime programs. Truman suddenly had to manage the final phase of the war, the transition to peace, and the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. The change was especially important because Roosevelt had personally managed alliances and wartime diplomacy. His death did not end those relationships, but it removed a leader who had shaped them through years of contact. Truman had to establish his own approach quickly, under conditions that included the defeat of Nazi Germany, the war against Japan, and the arrival of the atomic age. The United States that followed was not a return to the old republic. The federal government remained deeply involved in the economy and in social policy. The country kept its global military role and took a central place in the institutions created after the war. But Roosevelt's death made the transfer of this enormous power visible. It showed that the modern presidency had become a continuous national system, not just the personal project of one leader. Roosevelt died after leading the country through its greatest domestic and international emergencies, but before the post-war settlement was secure. His successor inherited the machinery, yet not the same history or authority. That gap helped produce a new style of decision-making and a presidency increasingly defined by global responsibility. Warren Harding's death created a different kind of national change because it exposed what had been hidden inside his administration. Harding died suddenly in 1923 while serving as president. His administration had promised a return to normal life after the upheaval of the First World War. Harding himself was personally popular, but several members of his administration were involved in scandals, including the Teapot Dome affair, in which government oil reserves were leased to private companies through corrupt arrangements. Harding did not live to face the full political consequences. Calvin Coolidge succeeded him and presented a quieter, more disciplined image of executive authority. The scandals continued to move through investigation and court proceedings, while Coolidge inherited the need to separate the presidency from the officials whose conduct had damaged its reputation. Harding's death changed the country because it transformed the meaning of his presidency. While he was alive, his administration could be viewed through speeches, popularity, and the promise of stability. After his death, the public began seeing the same administration through the conduct of its officials and the failures of oversight. The lesson was not that one president personally controlled every act of every subordinate. It was that a president's political style affects how a government is watched. Harding's death ended the possibility that he could directly explain, manage, or politically absorb the scandals. Coolidge inherited both the office and the burden of responding to them. A president's death can therefore make an administration easier to judge. It fixes the record in place while later evidence continues to arrive. Harding's presidency became less about the normality he advertised and more about the limits of weak oversight. John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 changed American politics through law, trust, and memory. Kennedy had been president for less than 3 years. His administration had faced the Bay of Pigs failure, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the early stages of the Civil Rights struggle, and growing American involvement in Vietnam. He was not a fully established national leader with a completed program. His death froze an unfinished presidency and gave his successor the political conditions to act with unusual force. Lyndon Johnson used the national grief after the assassination to push major legislation through Congress. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act became central achievements of the federal government, along with other Great Society programs. The movement for civil rights had been building for years, through protests, court cases, organizing, and federal pressure. Kennedy's death did not create that movement, but it changed the political atmosphere in which its demands were decided. Johnson could frame the legislation as part of the national response to a murdered president. That gave him leverage that Kennedy had not possessed in the same way. Measures that might have remained trapped in congressional opposition moved through a changed political landscape. At the same time, Kennedy's death damaged public trust. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible for the assassination and that no conspiracy had been established by the evidence it examined. But doubts persisted among many Americans, fueled by the violence of the event, incomplete knowledge, later revelations about government secrecy, and the difficulty of accepting a simple explanation for a national trauma. The political consequences moved in opposite directions. The assassination helped produce landmark civil rights laws, but it also deepened suspicion toward government. It created a lasting divide between the official account and the public's willingness to trust it. Kennedy's presidency is often remembered as a complete era, even though it ended before many of his major questions were settled. His death allowed later generations to imagine what might have happened next. The laws that followed are concrete. The alternate history is not. That difference is why the assassination remains politically powerful. It changed what the government did, and it changed how Americans interpreted what the government said. The seventh case is William Henry Harrison, whose death came early in his term but helped establish a rule for presidential succession. Harrison won the election of 1840 and became the oldest president at that time. He died only about a month after taking office. The country had never faced the death of a sitting president, so the Constitution did not clearly explain what should happen next. It said the powers and duties of the office would devolve upon the vice president, but it did not settle whether the vice president became president or merely acted as president. John Tyler claimed the full presidency. That decision established a precedent that would guide the country through later presidential deaths. Tyler took the office, not simply the duties, and the government continued under a clear chief executive rather than an uncertain temporary arrangement. The principle was later reinforced by constitutional practice and eventually formalized by the 25th Amendment. Harrison's administration had almost no time to create a policy legacy. His death mattered because it forced the country to answer a structural question before a more dangerous crisis arrived. That answer had consequences beyond Harrison's party. If a vice president had been treated as a caretaker, every future presidential death could have produced a dispute over authority. Instead, the United States moved toward a stable rule. When the presidency becomes vacant, the vice president succeeds to the office. Harrison's death is the least dramatic story on this list, but it may be the clearest example of a death changing the system itself. No assassination was needed. No major law followed immediately. The crisis was administrative and constitutional, and solving it quietly may be why the precedent lasted. These 7 deaths did not all have the same effect. Lincoln's assassination altered the path of Reconstruction. Garfield's death accelerated the end of patronage politics. McKinley's death elevated a more expansive model of presidential power. Roosevelt's death tested the transfer of a wartime state into the post-war world. Harding's death exposed the cost of weak oversight. Kennedy's assassination reshaped civil rights politics and public trust. Harrison's death clarified succession before the nation had a settled rule. In every case, the timing mattered more than the final day itself. Death removed a person, but it also opened a space. Into that space came a successor, a law, a scandal, a precedent, or a new interpretation of what the presidency could do. That is why a president's historical influence cannot be measured only by what he accomplished while alive. Sometimes the decisive consequence begins when the country has to continue without him.